This week on Talking Politics USA, what role could Trump play in the conflict between Israel and Iran?
This feels like a very dangerous moment for the Middle East and for the world. This all really comes down to one man, and that man is Donald Trump.
We speak to President Obama's photographer, Pete Souza, about the power of images in politics.
The photographs from the current administration, it looks like this from the set of a TV reality show.
And we hear how DC was transformed by the president's military parade.
We're the hottest country in the world right now.
These tanks rolling down the streets of Washington, D.C., something that we've never ever seen before. There were these huge barriers, which meant that your whole view was obscured, so I could only see this parade through a fence.
Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Lucy Watson and I've got a packed lineup of guests joining me on the show today. There is only one place we can start this week, and that is the developing situation in the Middle East. We're recording this podcast on Monday, day 4 of the conflict between Iran and Israel. And it is a fast-moving, constantly changing situation. But as I speak, the strikes by both sides are continuing, with more Iranian missiles breaching Israel's defence system, the Iron Dome, overnight. Meanwhile, Israel claims it has taken full operation control of the skies over Tehran. There are also reports that Iran is preparing to leave the nuclear treaty that prevents the spread of nuclear weapons. And all this as the leaders of the G7 meet in Canada. Before he headed to that summit, President Trump was asked by reporters at the White House about the prospects of de-escalation.
Well, I hope there's going to be a deal. I think it's time for a deal, and we'll see what happens. But sometimes they have to fight it out, but we're going to see what happens. I think there's a good chance there'll be a deal.
Now, our man in Washington, Dan Rivers, couldn't join me live for the show today, but he has been following developments closely from Washington, D.C. and sent us his analysis of the conflict and what role President Trump and the US might play in it.
Well, President Donald Trump is one of the only people, really, who can have an influence over the Israelis in this conflict and attempt to bring the two sides back to some sort of diplomatic track. And that is simply really because of the massive influence the United States has when it comes to providing military aid to Israel. Over the last 10 years, there is a memorandum of understanding between the US and Israel, which provides for about $4 billion worth of military aid per year. And then since October the 7th, there has also been about 18 billion of extra military aid and drawing down of military stocks and so on. Now, so far, he hasn't indicated any willingness to exert any real pressure on Benjamin Netanyahu, but there is that potential there. So I think he is the only person really who could say to the Israelis, right, enough's enough. This is escalating dangerously. You must now stop these attacks, both sides, and come back to the negotiating table. The Iranians have already indicated that they want to reopen these talks, which were underway before or as Israel started to attack Tehran. So I think this all really comes down to one man, and that man is Donald Trump. But he is so mercurial and unpredictable, it's very difficult to say what exactly he's planning to do next. I think when it comes to Iran, we are at a really dangerous moment because there is no disincentive for them at the moment not to decide to start enriching uranium to a very high degree and going for a nuclear bomb. Really, their backs are against the walls. The regime there knows that this is potentially existential for them. And I can't really see why they wouldn't instruct their nuclear scientists to go ahead and try and achieve a nuclear weapon in the next couple of months. So I think inadvertently, although the Israeli action may have knocked back attempts by Iran to get a nuclear bomb, perhaps by a year or two, if the regime survives and if US B-2 bombers are not involved in taking out some of those facilities, which are sort of half a mile underground, I think the unintended consequence will be actually speeding up Iran's nuclear quest for an atomic weapon. And that could be a really dangerous moment then, because of course then there will be other countries in the region and around the world which will watch what is unfolding in Iran and conclude that the only way to ensure that their own government and regime survive is to have a nuclear deterrent like the North Koreans. So you might see countries like Sudan, like Turkey, like Venezuela, all decide, well, we feel threatened, we feel insecure, and the best way of ensuring the longevity of our regime is to go ahead and push for a nuclear weapon in the same way that Iran may consider it's going to as well. It's going to be very difficult to de-escalate this situation. I think what might precipitate that would be if the Israelis felt that their air defences were really being tested by the Iranians, if the Iranians try and overwhelm them with constant huge numbers of missiles, and if on the other hand the Iranians feel like this is critical and that their regime is going to be toppled if they don't come to the negotiating table, then I can see a path where both sides feel it is in their interests to call an end to this retaliatory round of attacks and come back to some sort of diplomatic track. But at the moment that seems a very distant prospect, it must be said, and this feels like a very dangerous moment for the Middle East and for the world.
For the next part of the show, I'm delighted to be joined by former Chief White House photographer Pete Souza, a man who has seen the presidency in action in a way few people have. Pete worked with President Ronald Reagan and more recently held the role during the whole of Barack Obama's 8 years in office. During his time in the White House, Pete was given unprecedented behind-the-scenes access, witnessing firsthand the agonising decisions the presidents had to grapple with and moments which have gone down in history. And I think it's fair to say he spent more time with President Obama than almost anyone during his administration. Pete, it is absolutely great to have you on the show today. How are you and what are you up to these days?
I am doing a little of this and a little of that, but mostly spending time with my two granddaughters, which is why I'm in Illinois. Yeah.
Oh, well, that's lovely. But we're not going to talk about your granddaughters today because the before the granddaughters is just so utterly fascinating. And I suppose what I want to know initially is, for you, what should a good photo of a president of the United States of America capture? What's the essence that needs to be captured in a photograph?
Well, I think for a photographer with a photojournalistic background, you're looking for a moment in time, but also one that creates a mood and shows the president's humanity, and in some instances shows some emotion. In addition, I mean, I always looked at the photographs that I was taking as timeless. They need to stand up over time. The role of the official White House photographer is to create this body of work for our national archives, not for the next day's newspaper or social media. So I think you think a little differently in terms of the way you make your photographs, just thinking more timeless.
In terms of the kind of photographs that you took back then when you were working alongside Ronald Reagan, when you were working alongside President Obama, in comparison to the photographs that are coming out of the current White House, how are they different in your eyes?
In my eyes, the biggest difference is the photographs from the current administration, the Trump administration. It looks like this from the set of a TV reality show. You don't really get any sense of what's happening behind the scenes. You don't get any sense of, Trump's actual humanity, how he relates to people. It's all, let's bring the press corps in for an entire meeting, and he's just playing to the cameras. So I don't get any sense from the photographs that I've seen, what's really happening behind the scenes. They are also using AI to create images. For instance, after Pope Francis died and a new pope was installed, he came up with a photoshopped AI version of himself as the pope, thinking that that was a cute thing to do. And to me, if you're going to do that, then you've lost all credibility in what you're posting. I mean, once you post fake images, AI or photoshopped images, then I think you've lost all credibility. And I would not lend credence or feel that any photograph that the Trump administration posts is real, because if they've done it, before, they can do it again.
Does it matter to you? You mean you've said several times now about this being the reality show, the Trump reality show. I mean, we talk about it all the time on Talking Politics USA about, his whole administration, whether that be the rows that are conducted over social media. It is very much a reality show. Does it matter, do you think, that that's the image we're getting now in comparison to years gone by? Do you think that's just the evolution of time, or do you think that it really matters?
I do think it matters. I mean, the White House has posted almost 4,000 images on their Flickr photo stream. Not a single one shows anything that's remotely behind the scenes when history hopefully is taking place. There's not a single picture of Trump meeting with his national security team in the Situation Room. There's not a single picture of him on the phone with Vladimir Putin. Why is that? Are these photographs not being taken, or is the White House just refusing to post them? To me, they are historical. We, as I said, we have a National Archives. All of the photographs that I took during both the Reagan and Obama administrations, every single photograph is now at the National Archives. The purpose of which is that there is a record, a visual record of history of those administrations. And so I worry that we're not going to have that kind of record with the Trump administration.
I mean, I can remember that. I mean, maybe it is the picture of the Obama years, of that picture of him glued in the Situation Room to when Osama bin Laden in the house and was being found and ultimately killed. I can remember that image. They capture a moment in our history, in the world's history. And so when you hear Donald Trump saying, "Oh, I spoke to Putin," or "I spoke to Zelensky on the phone last night," it does seem incredible that we are not actually able to then see an image of this nature.
Some of your viewers will say, "Oh, what's the big deal? It's just a picture of a guy on a phone." But, to me, a photograph can show who else is in the room, what's the mood taking place. I think those are important things historically to have a visual record of.
One of the images that has stuck with me since Trump came to office again in January is, and I want to know your thoughts about this picture, is the photograph of him and Zelensky just before the Pope's funeral. And I saw that, kind of doing the rounds on social media from journalists that I follow. And it had such a profound effect on me when I saw that picture. I felt so many emotions, the overriding one being of hope. But what do you think is the story behind that image? Because that felt real to me looking at it.
No doubt, no doubt. I'm glad you brought that up. To me, that's the one real photograph of this administration. It was taken by somebody with the Ukrainian team. It's an iPhone photograph, so it's probably one of Zelensky's aides that made that photograph. It was not an official photographer. I thought it was great that this person, whoever he or she is, was smart enough to make an iPhone picture of that scene, because it was remarkable. And Those are the kind of images we're missing from this administration.
When you were the man behind the lens, Pete, I mean, are there any rules? I mean, don't come in when I'm brushing my teeth or getting ready for bed. Don't document a row with me and Michelle or me telling off the girls. Were there any rules when you were in that White House with Obama?
There are no rules other than common sense, and intuition. No, I'll give you an example. So I was very cognizant of that he had two young girls, his daughters, in the White House, and he's, in addition to being president, is a father. And my job was to document him as a dad and as a husband. But there are times, like, for instance, there's one, I remember that I have this one picture of him out on a swing set with his older daughter, Malia. There was a swing set right outside the Oval Office, and he saw Malia there after school one day. And I went outside with him as he sat on the swing set and just was having a private conversation with Malia about her day at school. And it was a nice picture, and I made several frames of that. But then I backed away. I mean, I didn't need to be lurking the entire time. I wanted to give him some privacy to have a conversation with his daughter where there wasn't some guy over, listening in to what they were saying. That's just common sense and intuition.
You were with him probably pretty much every single day. Who is he, and what is he to you, Pete?
I mean, I think you get a sense of who he is from my photographs. I mean, I think I tried to show his humanity. He's a decent human being, flawed like all of us in some ways. But I always felt he was a good dad. I think you can see that in the pictures as well, and that he worked hard, that he tried to do what he thought was the right thing. With both Reagan and Obama, whether you agreed or disagreed with their policies, I always felt they thought they were doing the right thing for the American people.
Now, I have my favorites of Obama. I particularly love the one of him on his own in his shirt and tie, playing basketball, shooting some hoops alone in the White House grounds. For me, and I think he's taking a break from meetings, for me, that kind of just encapsulates a man who has, one of the most important job in the world, but still breaking away and doing something he likes to get himself some headspace. And the other one I really love is him with the little boy, quite early on in his presidency, I think it was, and he lets him touch his hair. And for me, that's creates you see his humanity there. They are my favorites of his time as president. You must have some favorites, and Obama himself must have some favorites. Do you know what they are, and what's yours?
Well, I think his favorites are the ones of him with his girls. No question. He although there was one, he did like the Spider-Man photograph. This was a little kid, 3-year-old
That's my producer
kid.
Marcus's favorite as well, I think.
Yeah, who was zapping him into a spider's web just outside the Oval Office. That I remember. When we had hung that one on the walls of the West Wing, and he said that was his favorite photograph until we put one up of him with his daughters, and that those were always his favorites. I do like the one of Jacob Philadelphia, the young boy who is touching his head, the one you referred to. It symbolized to a lot of people in our country, that here's this 6-year-old African-American kid touching the head of the President of the United States that looks like him, and how that resonated with other young kids of color. That kid, by the way, is now a college student here in the U.S. and majoring in political science, which I think is so cool.
Thank you very, very much for chatting to me this afternoon. It was great to talk to you and get those insights. Take care of yourself, Pete. Well, that was Pete Souza, the official White House photographer to Presidents Reagan and Obama, speaking to me. And you can watch my full conversation with Pete on our YouTube channel. Just search for ITV News. Now, for the final part of this week's show, I am delighted to be joined from Washington by Stacy Foster, who's been in the States covering for Dan while he's been away. And it's been quite a busy week for you, hasn't it, Stacey? Even from the very moment your plane touched down. Just run me through that first of all.
Yeah, I got on a plane at London Heathrow heading for Washington, only to be told mid-air that actually I'd be going to Los Angeles. So as soon as we landed in Washington, it was a quick turnaround, straight on the first plane out of Washington to head to LA, where there were protests. And I do not know. I think I arrived in Los Angeles at about midnight. We were filming on the streets of LA until about 3 a.m. I'd got my luggage with me. And that's kind of sometimes how it happens. But it was a crazy turnaround. And so now back on the East Coast in Washington, I'm still not quite sure what time it is. But it's getting
that's over a week later.
I know.
What was it like out in LA then, Stacey? You know, thrust right into the middle of a major story as soon as you landed.
Yeah, what we saw was trouble, if you want to call it that, confined to a few blocks of downtown Los Angeles. That first night when I arrived, the police had it under control. Most of the protesters had left the area. The second evening, we saw the National Guard protecting those federal buildings. And what we saw was the LAPD, supported by traffic police and the sheriff's department, controlling the crowds. At no point did we see the US military, the Marines, on the streets of LA. And actually, you know, it looked like the police had got a hold on this, particularly after the mayor had called that curfew at 8 p.m., which meant that crowds were told to leave the area or face arrest. It really felt like law enforcement on the ground at state level had a control on it at that point. At no point did we feel like the whole of LA was going to be on fire, as Trump put it.
Was there a sense, did you think, that this was the politicization of the military?
Yeah, I think what we saw was this ongoing dispute. This wasn't the first time that Trump and the state governor, Gavin Newsom, had gone head to head on issues. And I think what we saw was Trump getting involved in something that perhaps could have been dealt with at state level. As I say, we saw the National Guard in front of those federal buildings. Legally, that was all that they were able to do. But what we saw on the streets was the LAPD actually getting quite hands-on and policing these protests as they turned into violent protests later on in those evenings.
And Stacey, you know, now you're back on the East Coast. You got to witness yesterday the full-on military parade through Washington. That was, you know, celebrating 250 years of the U.S. Army. But I guess that, you know, the irony can't be lost that, you know, there was yesterday Trump celebrating his armed forces for battles they've won, successes they've had. But actually, the week previous, he deployed them onto its country's own streets. What was the parade like yesterday?
I mean, it was quite something to be there. I managed to, it was difficult to actually, not knowing the real lay of the land here, actually, heading down there as a normal person trying to get to the front and see this parade. And I felt like I was in a queue for hours, really. But then once I managed to get to near the Washington Monument, I was able to, you know, the crowds dispersed. I was able to see quite a lot of the parade. But what I found really interesting was there were these huge barriers, you know, 7 foot tall in some places, which meant that your whole view was obscured. So I could only see this parade through a fence, which is not how it was shown on television. But it was a real, to witness what I saw on the West Coast, and then to see on the East Coast this display of American strength. But, just a few days earlier, the US military were being deployed on the streets. The whole role is to protect the American people. It was a real, just the juxtaposition of that was just, incredible to see, these tanks rolling down the streets of Washington, D.C., something that we've never, ever seen before. And the rain threatened to rain on Donald Trump's parade. It didn't. And he
I see what you've done there, Stacey. Very clever.
Yeah, well, the first thing he said about the parade, actually, after it was, well, the weather forecasters got it wrong, didn't they? It was fine. It was all fine. And yeah, there were just
fake news
showers. Oh, gosh, yeah, absolutely.
It wasn't just about celebrating the army, of course. It was his 79th birthday. So nice do if you can hold one such like that.
Yeah, the line has been, this was the 250th anniversary of the US Army, but let's not forget, yes, it was Donald Trump's 79th birthday, and he did get his happy birthday, although it wasn't perhaps the full song that he wanted, but I think what was remarkable was just to see this happening. It's something that he wanted in his first term. He'd seen the Bastille Day celebrations in France. He sees other countries putting on these huge displays, and he wanted a bit of that for himself. And I think in his speech, which was actually one of the shorter speeches that he's given at an event, I think just around 10 minutes, and he said it was time for America to celebrate its victories, which I think was really interesting to hear him speaking in that tone on that evening, which of course was not only the anniversary of the US Army, but also his 79th birthday.
Thanks to their extraordinary service and devotion, 250 years later, America stands tall, America stands proud, and America stands free. We're the hottest country in the world right now, and our country will soon be greater and stronger than ever before.
Well, I've witnessed those kind of military parades once in North Korea, even several in China when I was out there. And to be honest, I did expect it to be a bit more flashy out in Washington yesterday. But of course, it was, obviously overshadowed as well by the turmoil that's going on in the Middle East and the assassination of the lawmaker and her husband in Minnesota. But what I did notice, which, I guess is perhaps not surprising, is, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, he was yawning. And then I think one of his intelligence officers, was on his phone constantly. Everyone's focus was not on Donald, was not on this military parade, as perhaps they thought that it would be a week ago.
Yeah, it did feel at times a little bit flat, and I think we got that even in how Happy Birthday was sung at that point as well. It did. There were times where it did feel a little bit lacking that, pizzazz that we always see around Donald Trump. So I'm not entirely sure whether that was because of events that have happened in the US this week overshadowing this military parade. I think also it was interesting walking through Washington yesterday. This city has had to deal with so much disruption because of this parade. There were tourists trying to get a view of the White House yesterday who simply couldn't because all the crowd barriers are still in the way. That huge stage that was erected for Donald Trump to watch this parade was still up. There was construction workers trying to take it all down, and people were getting frustrated that they couldn't actually enjoy the monuments of this city. So yeah, I do get a sense that actually it wasn't quite the parade that they hoped for.
I'm just going to correct myself, Stacey, and it was his Middle East envoy who was actually on his phone, not a security chief. The other thing, as while this was all going on over the weekend, there were huge protests in cities across the country, weren't there? These No Kings protests. What essentially were they all about? Obviously against Donald Trump, but what more than that?
Yeah, I mean, it's this idea, isn't it, that military parades are seen in they are something that a dictator would want to put on in their country, and I think the No Kings movement is seen as a rejection of authoritarianism. We saw in Washington, actually, there was pockets of protests once again at certain points around the parade, but there wasn't one central large display of protest here, and that's probably because of the huge policing operation around this parade. But certainly across America, these No Kings protests spread. We saw the protests in LA, but we also saw a huge display in places like San Francisco, New York. There was a real show and a real rejection of Donald Trump and his policies across the country. And he said, didn't he, that these protests would be really harshly policed. He said that he hadn't even heard about any protests that were due to be taking place on the day of this parade, but they did, and the protesters were out in numbers. And I think what this shows is a country that is really divided on lots of issues, but particularly around its president and his policies.
Well, Stacey, your feet might not have touched the ground since you got to the States, but I think you might be heading home at some point, maybe in the next few days or something. But anyway, hope you get to put your feet up when you're back in the Midlands. Thank you very much for chatting to me today. That is it for this week. Thank you to all our guests on the show today. It's Pete, Stacey and Dan. Thank you too for listening and for watching. Remember, you can catch up with every episode of Talking Politics USA on ITVX and YouTube, as well as on your favourite podcast platform. Please do subscribe if you're enjoying the show and leave us a review. Talking Politics UK will be in your feed on Wednesday, and we will be back next week. Until then, goodbye.